Hi everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture we are going to learn about Svetlana Alexandrovna Alexievich. Svetlana Alexievich was born in 1948 in Stanislav, now known as Ivano-Frankovsk or Ivano-Frankivsk in western Ukraine. Her mother was Ukrainian and her father was Belarusian, and the family moved to Belarus when she was a child, but she spent most of her childhood actually in Ukraine with her grandmother. And she credits that time with her grandmother listening to women's stories with interesting her in writing and storytelling and wanting to convey people's voices, and especially wanting to convey women's voices and women's stories. She received a journalism degree from Belarus State University in 1972 and worked as a journalist in the 1970s. She began working on The Unwomanly Face of War in the 1980s, and excerpts were published in 1984 in journals. And the book came out in 1985, but in a censored form. There was some stuff that, as she says in the current version, she was not allowed to publish. It was considered to be derogatory to Soviet womanhood. Nonetheless, the book was wildly popular, and 2 million copies had been printed and distributed by the end of the 1980s. And multiple plays and TV dramas, such as the one on the left, were based on it. So it was a huge literary sensation when it first came out. She continued to use the same technique that she used for The Unwomanly Face of War to write a total of 5 books in what she has termed the Cycle of the Big Utopia, or the Cycle of the Red Human, focused on the experiences of the Soviet people, and especially, although not completely, the experiences of Soviet women. In her later works, she includes many male perspectives, but her focus has always been on women's voices in particular. And the 5 books in this cycle are The Unwomanly Face of War, about female veterans of World War II, Last Witnesses, which was about children who experienced World War II, Zinky Boys, about the Soviet war in Afghanistan, Voices from Chernobyl, as it's called in English, or Chernobyl Prayer, as it's known in Russian, which was obviously about the Chernobyl disaster, and Secondhand Time, which was about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Voices from Chernobyl was particularly successful and also inspired numerous theatrical productions. You can see a picture to the right of the slide from one of the theatrical productions, and films, I believe, in English as well as Russian. Svetlana Alexievich has a unique technique that she herself basically invented, which has generated both lots of praise and lots of controversy. For each book, she spends several years interviewing people, normally 500 to 700 subjects, so an enormous amount of legwork. Again, she trained as a journalist and worked as a journalist, and the basis of her technique is interviewing live subjects. She then takes the recordings and transcripts of the interviews and copies out key passages and reads them to herself and edits them and tries to get the sound of authentic human speech. And again, what she's looking for is this sound of authentic human speech, similar to what she first heard as a child listening to women tell stories back in the village in Ukraine, where she spent a lot of her childhood. And she calls her genre novels and voices. Others call it documentary prose. And it combines elements of both fiction and nonfiction, which is kind of difficult for Western readers to deal with. In the West, we have this very sharp distinction between fiction and nonfiction. This is less the case in Russophone writing, where a lot of fiction is expected to have autobiographical elements or some kind of eyewitness elements. At the same time, things like memoirs often include impressions or stories from other people. So it's not just your own story, but other people's stories as well. And so her work has generated a lot of controversy and has been criticized. for being more fictional than most Western readers realize. So a lot of Western readers just take it as straight up nonfiction. And again, it is heavily based on journalism and has the strong element of nonfiction in it, but it's not completely journalism. It's not completely nonfiction. She's also received some criticism for using the stories of oppressed people. So she goes and she collects stories from people who otherwise can't have their stories told, and she shares their stories. And you can see that as really noble, or you can see that as using the stories of people whose own voices have been silenced. And again, there's controversy over this. At the same time, she has been praised for sharing these stories that otherwise would not have been shared with the public, and giving this extremely authentic voice to multiple perspectives on major world events, and really giving this very authentic voice to the experience of the Soviet and post-Soviet sort of people or peoples. And I personally think that what she's doing is really important. And overall, she's doing more good than harm in the world. She has been the target of lawsuits. She has been the target of criticism. A lot of this seems to be politically motivated, or at least somewhat politically motivated, because of her opposition to Lukashenko, the current president of Belarus. At the same time, it is important to understand that what she's presenting to us is not completely nonfiction, and that she is taking people's stories, like real people's stories, and then kind of mixing them around, presenting them under other names and things like that. And so it's this unique literary technique that she herself has kind of invented that is both highly effective and controversial. Politically, she has been quite active. She has been a longtime critic of the Belarusian president, Lukashenko. And because of this, her works have largely not been published in Belarus under Lukashenko's administration, which has lasted for about 30 years now. And she has been subject to various lawsuits in Belarus, which appear probably to be politically motivated, in which specifically some of the subjects in Zinky Boys, her third book about the war in Afghanistan, sued her for misrepresenting them. She has lived abroad for much of the time since the year 2000. She moved abroad then, came back to Belarus in 2013, and then I believe is living abroad again now. She was part of the opposition activities during the political protests following the 2020 presidential elections in Belarus, which I think that forced her to move abroad again. And in case you don't know, Lukashenko was reelected as president in 2020. There were protests about irregularities. The opposition politician, who many people thought should have won the election, I believe he was arrested, but then his wife carried on this campaign protesting Lukashenko. And there was this sort of women's campaign that was largely run by women of protesting the elections, and Alexievich was a big part of that. She's also been critical of both sides in the post-2014 conflict in Ukraine, and she has said that there has been a lack of willingness to engage in dialogue on all sides, an unwillingness to understand or hear each other out on all sides, and that what we're seeing is the result of Soviet policies that glorified war at the expense of understanding and dialogue. Alexievich is the only author in this course who is still living, so it's too early to say definitively what her legacy will be, but it will probably be significant. She received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2015 for this basically new genre or new style of literature that she created that combines journalism with elements of what you might call literature with a capital L, or high literature, or something like that. She has focused on giving voice to underrepresented groups, especially women, and to representing multiple sides of an experience. So she's known for what's called polyphony, or multiple voices, and so she tries to get multiple perspectives on the same event or the same experience. And so you get this very nuanced and diverse view of events by reading her works. She is also engaged in opposition to this return of authoritarianism in Eastern Europe. I don't even know if I want to call it a return. Most of Eastern Europe has always been, or for the past 1,000 years, has been fairly authoritarian and continues to be fairly authoritarian. She calls for peace, dialogue, and compassion for all sides. So she has been trying to resist war and authoritarianism while also not engaging in inflammatory and warmongering comments and policies, unlike many of her contemporaries and many people in Eastern Europe. And so it seems likely that she will go on to have a major literary and political legacy, and she really has done amazing work specifically in giving voice to women and engaging in creative original work as a woman giving voice to other women. And so we saw how historically women were not considered to have the right or the ability to engage in creative endeavors and to voice their own experiences. And she has really gone against that, and a major focus of her life's work is specifically telling women's stories, giving voice to women, and showing women as engaging in creative and literary work, and women's stories as being central to the human experience. And so, what will come of it is hard to know at this point, but we can hope that she has opened up for us a whole new world of literature and of psychology and sort of understanding of human nature and the human experience.